Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Trava Olivier, the Museum Educator for the Pipestone County Historical Society, and I'm here with December's Coffee Talk on the history of agriculture in Pipestone County. Today's Coffee Talk is going to look slightly different because, due to Minnesota weather, we do not have an in-person event. So I will be sharing the presentation, but there won't be an opportunity for people in the crowd to ask questions. The last slide of the presentation does have contact information for the Pipestone County Historical Society. So if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me after you watch this recording, and I will do my best to answer any questions that you have. And with that, I guess it's time to get started. As you can see from my opening screen, we're going to talk about the history of Pipestone County agriculture from 1874 to 2022. Obviously, that's a long time span. I'm going to be touching briefly on topics. Sometimes I might not get as in detail as you would like. I apologize for that, but there's a lot to cover. The definitive start date of 1874 has to do really with the settlement of Pipestone County. If we look at the next slide on the beginnings, in 1874, that's when our first settlers were arriving. Now, the state of Minnesota was turned into a state, had changed from a territory in 1858, and land was set aside and created for Pipestone County. But there weren't settlers living here for any length of time and enough people to actually organize and function as an existing county. People started to come in later on in settlement. A large part of that had to do with the Dakota Uprising of 1862. There was no Native American foot traffic to the sacred quarries, and it scared some settlers off after stories of events that occurred between settlers and natives in surrounding counties. The government was pushing for westward expansion of the country through the Homestead Act of 1862, and that act was later revised and gave time served credit to Union soldiers. So in the original act, it took 5 years to file a claim and prove up meeting certain requirements every year. With the change, those who fought in the Civil War could get credit for time served. That led to a mass of Civil War veterans settling our county. In 1874, there were 4 10-acre sections that were broken in ground, but actually nothing was planted that year. In 1875, more settlers arrived and 100 acres of ground was broken, but only 10 acres were planted. And that was a year that the grasshoppers did most of the harvesting. So if you remember reading the Little House on the Prairie books by Laura Ingalls Wilder and her talking about the grasshopper plagues, those came through this region of the country. In 1876, there were 52 claims filed for 160 acres each. 60 acres were planted into wheat that year, and 10 acres were planted into potatoes. And once again, the grasshoppers came back through and harvested the crops for the settlers. In 1877, those diehard settlers tried again, and another 100 claims was filed. 300 acres were successfully harvested that year, and the first livestock arrived in Pipestone County when Duncan Stewart came with 47 cows and calves and an additional 15 horses. 1878 then would be described as the boom year, in my opinion, when 550 claims were taken through the Homestead Act and an additional 247 railroad contracts were entered into. The railroad, in the push for the Transcontinental Railroad and the expansion of the country, had been granted some land from the government, and after they chose the location they were going to build their tracks, the remaining land was often sold off to settlers, and that's what that additional 247 additional contracts is representative of. A total of 7,500 acres were broken and about 500 acres were planted in the year of 1878, and there was also an additional 40,000 trees planted. Along with settlers being able to take a homestead claim, they were also allowed to take a tree claim, and so many settlers did. Being part of the tall grass prairie, most of the trees we see today were carried in and are the seeds of trees that originally came to the county. We were a tall grass prairie, so grasses grew 6 to 7 feet high in places, but trees were few and far between and mostly along water sources. The image you see in the picture is a sod house that is next to a haystack on the Pipestone County prairie, and that's what our earliest homesteaders would have had to live in because we were that treeless prairie, and shipping Wood to a nearby railroad station still meant about a 3-day travel overland from Laverne to get it to your homestead claim. The haystack is of the prairie hay that they were harvesting. As we move out of the 1870s and get into the 1880s, there was continued an expansion and settlement in the county. The crops were good and wheat was the king crop of the day, and work was done by horsepower. And these images show that, what farming with horses looked like. As we move into, or continue in the 1880s and through the turn of the century, there was one iconic farm agricultural experience that many people aren't aware of, and that was the Percheron Horse Farm that was in existence in Pipestone County from 1880 to about 1901. The pictures you see are pictures of that. The upper left shows an ad that was in the Pipestone County Star. We also see the big barn in the upper right that was destroyed by a fire, and in the below right and left we see a broodmare barn and a granary. The Percheron Horse Farm encompassed many acres. It was owned by the Payne Lumber Company from Wisconsin. They leased it to the Minnesota Percheron Horse Company, who in turn hired a manager to live on site and take care of the day-to-day operations. There were 2 managers over its course of time, one being a Mr. Ketchum and the other being a Mr. Reynolds. In addition to raising horses that were purebred and shipped in from France, which the Payne Lumber Company wanted to use in their timberlands in Wisconsin, they also raised cows, pigs, sheep, many varieties of poultry. They also had what was called tenant farming happening, meaning farmers could come in, stake a piece of that Percheron horse farm for their own. They would provide the seed, the tools, the equipment. They would plant and harvest the grains grown there, and they would in turn turn over 1/3 of their harvest to the granary of the Percheron horse farm in payment for rental of the land. As we continue into the 1890s, we saw the arrival of the first horse-pulled steam engines in terms of the reaper and the thresher. These quickly modernized, so to speak, not by our standards, but by going from using a scythe and a hay fork, which was all muscle, physical work for the farmer or the homesteader, getting a steam binder or a horse-pulled thresher made quicker work of the tasks ahead of them. It also allowed neighbors to work together and quickly complete the tasks. 1893 and 1894 brought some drought to the area. So in 1895, the government created a loan program to help farmers purchase seed for the coming years. 1898 proved to be a very wonderful year for the weather. There was an abundant harvest, and after several lean years, things were on a high note. As we moved into the 1900s and the 19-teens, there was the continuation of using horses pulling steam-powered equipment, but we also learned about crop diversity. These images are of the halfway farm that was located between Pipestone and Lincoln County, and it shows a wagon load of potatoes as well as potatoes in the sack in the field. There was a time after years of planting wheat that the yields began to diminish greatly, and the University of Minnesota became aware that it was because of soil depletion of the nutrients from planting the same crop year after year. Farmers recognize this today. The University of Minnesota was looking at other crops that might be successful in our area, and they determined that the climate was right for growing potatoes. And so there was an area in the history of Pipestone County during the late 1900s and into the early 19-teens where potato was the king crop for many people. It's what they planted and harvested, and a few people did quite well successfully and reaped what would have been over $100,000 by today's standards in potato harvest. But as with everything, when one person is successful, other people like to capitalize on it. And so more and more farmers began to plant potatoes. Of course, when that happens, there is an oversupply of product. And when there's oversupply of product, prices begin to tumble. Farmers began to have trouble marketing their potatoes, so they built warehouses to store them in. Climate needs to be right for storing potatoes. Too cold and they freeze and they turn black and rot. Too much moisture and they also become rotten. And so it proved to be not successful. And within a few years, maybe 8 to 10 years of potato being a cash crop in Pipestone County, it was quickly gone by the wayside and returned to more traditional crops grown in the county, though some of the methods of planting and rotating are beginning to change. When we reach the 1920s, we start to see the arrival of the earliest gas-powered tractors. Motor vehicles begin replacing the horse and buggy for transporting livestock and equipment between the farm and the marketplace. The first government programs also went into play to stabilize the business of farming, and that was following World War I. During World War I, many countries across the ocean were at war. Their farmers or young men were fighting the war, and so there was a need for food supplies. The United States shipped multiple tons of product overseas to their allies, and when the war ended, those exports dropped sharply because there was no longer a need for the American product. There was also an increase in the size of dairy herds and creameries in the 1920s due to the invention of refrigeration. The images you see at the bottom of this slide are of 1920s era tractors, and I would note that they have steel wheels because rubber had not yet been invented. As we move to the next slide, we see some of the creameries that sprang up after the invention of refrigeration around the county. Shown are the Cazenovia, the Edgerton, the Jasper, and the Rutan Creamery. Farmers could milk their cows and take their cream to the creameries in the local station, which were located along the rail line, and then those creameries would ship it to a larger creamery, such as the one in Pipestone, where it would be turned into products like butter or cream for making ice cream and so on. There were several creameries making butter within the county. There were also ice cream manufacturing plants within the city of Pipestone. As we move into the 1930s, that's an era that we often hear referred to in our history books as the Dirty 30s. And I wondered what that looked like in Pipestone County. We know there was severe drought, and we know that it led to poor yields. We also know that the Great Depression led to poor prices. Wheat was the main crop prior to the Dirty 30s, but it was actually replaced by the growth of flax and corn. Soybeans were introduced into the county in the 1930s, and tractors have now largely replaced horses as the means of getting the task done. This is a flyer from the archive of the Pipestone County Museum from the Archer Daniel Midlands Company talking about marketing flax straw. It was proven that flax could do better in drought-like conditions than wheat was, and that's why it replaced wheat. Here are some headlines taken from the Pipestone County Star in the summer of 1934, which seems to be the summer in scrolling headlines that did the most significant impact to the farming operations that were happening in Pipestone County. Some of the headlines, as you can see, is drought cattle are being shipped. The government purchases here number 200 head. Other counties ship more. More drought and aid for the county is urged. The feed shortage in the county is acute. And the climax of the heat wave with record temperature of 106 degrees reached. And I would remind you that in 1930, there is no relief in your air-conditioned home. So those are the headlines, and we can see that the drought and the Great Depression are impacting Pipestone County. When we move into the 1940s, the weather stabilizes. There's good weathers for growing crops. Prices have regained and are now high. The problem is that there is a labor shortage for the average farm due to World War II. Many of the young men are off fighting in the war overseas, and there was a 35% drop in farm labor, which increased reliance on equipment. Corn also became the king crop to help with the war effort. It could be loaded onto trains, shipped to the coasts, put on a cargo ship, and shipped overseas to help with feeding the war effort for the Allied soldiers and American soldiers involved in the war. And flax continued to do well as it was discovered that the oil from the flax plant itself could be used for weapon lubrication. And that might sound a little bit different than we might think about a crop, but if we think about it today, soybeans are grown for many things, one of them being soybean oil. Some other things that came out of the 1940s are conservation practices. People discovered that during the Dirty 30s, when the soil was blowing and eroding away, there were ways to stop that. One way was to plant trees. If you planted trees, the root system would quickly help to hold the soil in place. This image is a bit difficult to see, but this is trees planted in Pipestone County. The red circle is outlining some trees that have been newly planted. There was also terracing and cultivating on contours of slopes, and some of the earliest tiling practices for draining fields were begun in the 1940s. As we move forward into the 1950s, there is now improved mechanization. Sure, we had gas-powered equipment prior to this time period, but in the 1950s into the 1960s, the advent of power steering made farming with equipment even more convenient for the local farmer. There was also increased yields happening in crops planted in the county, and that comes from soil studies being done to understand the nutrient needs of the soil that farmers are planting in, increased fertilization methods, increased weed control and insect control methods, all of which help to make for better yields and to feed the world. The pictures that we see here are oats in the shock in 1958 and also a 1961 combine in a cornfield. Notice the size of that combine, much smaller and different than what we see in the fields driving across Pipestone County at harvest time today. The next images are some aerial photos of farms in the Pipestone County from the 1950s. Now, what I would note is that notice the size and the number of the buildings that were common on the farms. The farms had multiple barns on them. They had small silos or storage facilities. Most farms today, these old wood frame barns have been replaced by larger pole barns. We see mass barns for confinement for dairy cattle. We see large feedlots for cattle or sheep. We see confinement barns for hogs. We don't see the numerous small buildings. Most of them have gone by the wayside. And if we see storage equipment for grain, it's certainly large bins with complete setups for loading and unloading at market time. Other things that were different in the mid-century with farming that are very different than today are images we see here where free-range livestock was the norm as opposed to today's confinement operations. We see children outside their barn with their sheep, hogs outside in a lot. Not a common occurrence in the years of 2020 and beyond, but certainly very common mid-50s and into the 1960s. The image up there is of poultry at large in a pen outside of a barn. And the last image I included because it's an image of sheep arriving by train from Texas to Pipestone County. Shipping livestock by train was still very common into the middle of the 1900s, which we often today think of using livestock trailers and hauling it over the road by semis, but that was not the case in the 1950s and 60s. When we move into the 1970s, land prices have boomed, and farmers are rich on paper. That value of their land that they have purchased has gone up. There is export and demand for our products high worldwide because there is drought and famine happening across the world. The American government has encouraged the farmers to feed the world. So they have switched to minimum till practices to conserve their soil health. They've worked with their yields. They've done all their conservation practices, and they are producing more feed for the world in their fields than they ever had before. That made them a good risk. Agricultural lenders were willing to take a risk on farmers to help them grow and expand, buy larger equipment to plant more feed, buy more land to plant more ground. All of those things, they were considered a good risk. And that continued for a short time, but as the economy started to change and things changed, interest rates were very high. And when we hit the 1980s, we are in what has been called the farm crisis. I did not grow up in Pipestone County, but I am a child of the 80s, graduating from high school in the mid-1980s. I do remember the farm crisis from my childhood in South Dakota. I remember my father taking part in parades and demonstrations about the farm crisis. I remember neighbors that struggled and left the farm. The demand for our exports dropped when the famine in the other countries ceased. When the demand dropped, the prices fell. But the cost to produce that food continued to increase. Seed was still expensive. Insecticides, fertilizers were still expensive. The interest rates were high, and many family farms were failing. And they were reaching farm bankruptcy point where they could no longer sustain on the farm and were forced to sell. There were also farm foreclosures happening, and this was a worldwide trend, but it happened in Pipestone County. Headline from the Pipestone County Star, April 1st, 1982. Most agree, farmers facing one of their toughest years. As we click to the next page, more headlines. Real estate auction. There were 10 land and farm auctions advertised in the same issue of the Pipestone County Star. Note the bottom one, to be offered for sale by the First National Bank of Pipestone, Minnesota. That's a case of the bank now has foreclosed on the farm property. Of the 10 that were advertised in that spring issue of the Pipestone County Star, 2 of them were advertised as bank foreclosures. When we look at what happened in the farm crisis in the 1980s, we cannot talk about the tragedy that struck Pipestone County. On September 29th of 1983, 46-year-old James Jenkins and his son Stephen killed Ruthven Bank President Rudy Blythe and loan officer Toby Thulin. The farm had been vacated by the Jenkins. They had walked away, leaving Rudy Blythe and the Ruthven State Bank holding the note for it. It had been for sale for a few years. The day before, on September 28th, Rudy Blythe was contacted by a party who might be interested in this little 10-acre farm just outside of Ruthven. He arranged to meet the prospective buyer at the farm site the next morning. When Thulin and Blythe arrived, they were ambushed and shot. Thulin fell at his spot. Blythe ran, was struck by bullets, and passed away in the ditch nearby. The Jenkins family fled and were later located after a nationwide manhunt in Texas. Stephen Jenkins determined to turn himself in. He left his dad out in the country outside of Texas, of Paducah, Texas, where James Jenkins committed suicide. Stephen was brought back to Minnesota and stood trial in Lincoln County, and he was convicted of the crime and of being the murderer, though he claimed his father had done it, until years into his serving his sentence when he recanted that story and admitted his guilt in the actual person that did the murders. He served 30 years in prison. It was a tragedy. There were books written about it, one called Final Harvest and one called When Father and Son Conspire. If you'd like to know more, you could check through your local library systems about borrowing those books to read them because they are no longer in print. Occasionally, the museum receives copies of these. We have preserved copies in our research archive, and so we do offer them for sale in our gift shop when we have them, but we do not currently have any in stock. There was also an episode of City Confidential that aired a story about the murders around the year 2000, so a number of years after it had happened. It was season 2, episode 15. I have been able to find it online through the A&E network, so if you're interested, you might learn more about it there. This is the headlines of the Pipestone County Star following the incidents of that day. As we move into the modern day agriculture, we get to the 1990s and to today, and we see that there is a shift to no-till farming practices. There's an increase in tillage and draining. We have larger equipment. We now have corporate farming, which actually seems to be a lesson that was learned from the 1980s when many families lost their farm. If they incorporate and operate as an LLC, they are often able to at least save their home from foreclosure and bankruptcy type things should things not go the way they had hoped. The average farm size of tillable acres has actually decreased, but increased yields and seed genetics play a part. So even though less acres are being planted as land has been returned to CRP and some of the conservation practices, we continue to produce more food every year as a county due to increased yields, due to seed genetics. The other big change to agriculture today, as those of you still farming or who have recently farmed know or have visited with a farmer, is computerization. Computerization is key in record keeping. It's also key in GPS being an equipment. It helps farmers to know how to apply fertilizer and insecticides and things at rates that can vary across the field, making it more beneficial and cost-effective for the local farmer to participate in those kinds of practices. They also, with record keeping, are able to prove to bankers and other interested parties that they are being successful with their practices. Some comparisons of ag history over the years. In the 1940s, a farm had 1,319, there was an average of 1,319 farms in the county, and each averaged about 217 acres. Today, in 2012, so about 10 years ago, the average number of farms was only 676, so cut by about half, though they had increased the acres they averaged to 362. In 1940, about 0.7% of the crops planted was soybeans. By 2012, it accounted for 45% of the crops planted. In 1940, corn accounted for 36% of the crop planted. By 2012, it was up to 48%. And flax in 1940 was the fourth largest crop planted in the county, and in 2012, there were no acres planted. Some other statistical comparisons, if we look, wheat. In 1882, 10,911 acres of Pipestone County land was planted to wheat. By 2020, that was down to just 600 acres. In flax, in 1882, 7,800 acres versus 2020 when none were planted. Oats, 5,400 acres in 1882, down to 3,500 in 2020. Corn, 4,250 acres in 1882, up to 115,000 acres in more recent years. Barley, 1,960 acres in the 1880s, none in 2020 that were recorded. And finally, soybeans, none were planted in 1882, but in 2020 it accounted for 90,300 acres of production in the county. Other comparisons, when we look at livestock, 1882 horses, 1,200 head, 2020, 330. Cattle was 1,637 head, up to 59,712. You can see mules were 75, but unrecorded in 2020. Sheep jumped from 167 to 3,900. Hogs were at 707 head in the county in 1882. Let's take that number to 361,314 head in 2020, mostly in hog confinement facilities. Goats and laying hens were not recorded in the 1880s, and you can see that they have a lower number than average compared to our large livestock that we are raising in our county today, accounting for mostly small family flocks and not a commercial type of operation. It's also interesting to compare the land value. In the mid-1870s, you could acquire 160 acres of land for free if you took the Homestead Act, spent that 5 years proving up and meeting the conditions of it, and the only cost was the filing fee of $18, which accounts to about $485 today. By the 1890s, when there was no more free land available, the cost went from $8 to about $18 per acre. By 1911, it was $80 per acre. 1918, it had jumped to $115 per acre. 1958, which is 40 years later, it had taken just a small jump really to $165 per acre. But when we get to 2022, it accounts for $6,092 per acre on the average for cropland in Pipestone County. So as we look at those things, we can see that farming has changed a lot. Many of the things that you believe or know to be true or have heard about and learned in history across the nation holds true in Pipestone County. Some highlights from today's presentation that make us unique were the Percheron Horse Farm, the time when the potato was king, the time when we had a big creamery located within the confines of the city of Pipestone that served smaller creameries around the county. I pointed out at the beginning that there would be an opportunity to see my contact information so that if you have follow-up questions or comments you'd like to share, you can certainly do so with me via my email, which is Trava Olivier, that's my name, TRAVAOLIVIER @iw.net. We also have a general museum email and a telephone number that you can turn to if you have questions or comments about anything you saw in the presentation today. Thank you for watching.